All right. Sorry about that. All right, so we're talking about how there's these two regions, right? The variable region and the constant region. And so this variable region actually binds the antigen region. Another name for the variable region is the antigen binding region. But what happens is because they can bind these little components of the microbe, what they can do is if you have a whole bunch of these antibodies, recognizing a whole bunch of these antigens, these antibodies can actually bind to the actual microbe, like while it's before it's even eaten by a macrophage or a neutrophil. And these antibodies, what they do is they like surround this microbe. And what happens is because this microbe is surrounded, and these antibodies are binding to these microbe so much is that like the bacteria, what it does is it can't live as well, right? It prevents any binding of anything, or it just these antibodies just completely coat these microbes, and then what happens is your body can become more efficient in removing them. But what it does is it neutralizes this bacteria, or if antibodies develop against viruses, it neutralizes these viruses, and that prevents viruses from actually being able to enter into cells. Because viruses actually have an extracellular, all intracellular bacteria, right before they get in, they are outside, right? And so they have like an extracellular component as well. And so these antibodies, what they do is they opsonize and then they neutralize these pathogens. And then if you get more into the weeds, actually antibodies do a lot more than just opsonize and neutralize, but we're not going to get into all of that really. All right, so we're gonna really get into what we're really gonna get into this video is the anatomy of the lymph node and kind of how B cells and T cells are organized in the lymph node. So, all right, we got this lymphatic system all throughout the body, right? It's these series of tubes that are run parallel to the circulatory system, but there's these little nodes. And so if we look at these nodes, there's two big regions. This kind of inner part right here, and it's called the medulla, and this outer portion right here. And this outer portion is a whole bunch of regions called the cortex, and it's this big region right here. And this cortex can be subdivided into an inner portion and an outer portion. The inner portion right here is called a geminal center, and the follicle surrounding the geminal center is also part of the cortex as well. And the reason why these regions exist is because that's how you kind of organize the cells within the lymph node. So just side note real quick, you also have these vessels leading into the lymph node, and these vessels are actually containing these microbial debris, these antigens, and these antigens actually kind of come in through these vesicles, or these vessels, and then they can also exit these lymph vessels as well. And because, right, it's like these series of lymph nodes, and so it can enter into one and then exit and then enter into the next one and then exit. And so these antigens flow through the lymph node. But when we talk about these geminal centers, the way that it's organized is that B cells largely just lie in the geminal center, right? And so only the B cells are in the geminal center, while in the follicle, those regions surrounding it are T cells. And then in the medulla is also T cells as well. And so that's kind of the organization of the lymph node. Did I get all this? Geminal center, follicle edges on the... Yeah, okay. So that's kind of the anatomy. That's kind of how these lymph nodes are set up. But what's important is kind of the function of these lymph nodes and the physiology of the lymph nodes. And so what happens is that these antigens flow into this lymphatic vesicle right here. And what happens is that helper T cells, and remember, helper T cells, what they do is they activate cytotoxic T cells and B cells. These helper T cells are going to bind the antigen, and the helper T cells are going to become activated. And helper T cells, right, use cytokines to activate B cells and helper T cells use cytokines to activate B cells and T cells, cytotoxic T cells. So these helper T cells are going to activate, so they become activated, but then they activate cytotoxic T cells and B cells. Now, once cytotoxic T cells and B cells become activated, what they do is they then travel to the blood vessels. And if you remember, there's B cells and T cells in the actual blood vessel. And what that means is that they're coming out of the lymph node and traveling to the blood. And then, just to tie it all together, we have these T cells and B cells when they're in the blood, right? Once the innate system activates it, what happens is that the B cells and T cells then come out of the blood, or these B cells make antibodies, and then these antibodies can bind to these antigens and opsonize and neutralize, and then T cells can come out and kind of act like NK cells do and release cytokines to induce apoptosis of this cell, right? And so that's kind of the big picture, right? And so when, I think is this, yeah, this is the next slide. This is the last slide. So what happens is, right, is that if we're putting it all together, you have the innate immune system, right? These physical barriers are set up, and once something crosses these, it's going to release all these pathogens, whether they be intracellular or extracellular. If it's an extracellular pathogen, what's going to happen is that a macrophage is going to come in, start phagocytizing or eating these pathogens, and then it's going to kill a lot of these pathogens, but it's still not good enough. And so what it's going to do is it's going to signal neutrophils to come out of the blood, another innate leukocyte to come out of the blood, and then it also phagocytizes some of these extracellular pathogens. And what's going to happen is that neutrophils and macrophages, they're going to release the digested pathogen into the lymphatic system, and that microbial debris flows into the lymph node and activates helper T cells. And then helper T cells are going to then signal through cytokines to activate B cells, and B cells will then migrate into the blood. And then once they're in the blood, it's going to take this B cell receptor and then secrete it as an antibody. And antibodies are going to use that variable region to bind and opsonize and neutralize these extracellular pathogens. And so that's kind of the whole picture of the extracellular pathogen innate or immune response. For intracellular pathogens, again, we're going to breach these barriers. It's going to infect cells, right? And so it's going to be on the outside of the body. And while it's on the outside, actually you have a little extracellular response, but these intracellular infections, they go from the outside into cells, right? And so eventually you have an infected cell. And once you have an infected cell, these natural killer cells, which are an innate leukocyte, will then scan this layer and say, oh, the cell's infected, and it will become activated. Once it becomes activated, it's going to release cytokines. So NK cells actually have cytokines, and these cytokines are going to communicate. That's what cytokines do, is they communicate to other cells. These cytokines are going to communicate to these cells to die because they are infected. So they just take an L for the team. They're a good team player. These cells are a team player. They're going to take the L and they're going to die. And then eventually these non-infected cells are going to grow back and then repair the tissue. But the problem is, just like macrophages and neutrophils aren't enough, NK cells aren't enough. And so again, there's an extracellular component to intracellular infection. So these macrophages are going to eat some of these pathogens while they're outside of cells right before they enter in, and they're going to chew up these intracellular pathogens and then release them into the lymphatic system. Again, these intracellular pathogens, this intracellular microbial debris, these intracellular antigens are going to enter into the lymph node and activate helper T cells just like before. And these helper T cells are then going to activate cytotoxic T cells. And cytotoxic T cells are then going to enter into the bloodstream. And then once cytotoxic T cells are into the bloodstream, they are going to be recruited out of the blood where the site of infection is. And then these cytotoxic T cells are going to release a whole bunch of cytokines. And again, the adaptive arm is way stronger. And so both B cells and T cells are better at removing pathogens, whether it be eating or neutralizing things or inducing these cells to apoptose. And then you're going to kill this monolayer here through cytokines again. And then and so once these cells apoptose, then you have a successful removal of these pathogens. And because these pathogens are removed now, you then restore homeostasis, and that's the whole purpose of the immune system, right? The whole purpose of the immune system is to restore homeostasis and get it back to how it was before this injury occurred and these pathogens were released. So that's a big introduction onto the immune system, and it's all very interesting. Kind of take this and annoy your parents with it, or go post a little TikTok video or something. Yeah, that's the immune system. So the next video, though, what we're going to talk about, this is just a little bonus video, is, I think it's like literally bonus, is we're going to talk about how the immune system responds to the coronaviruses, right? This coronavirus pandemic, and how the immune system can both help and hurt people that are infected with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19.